Well, it's lovely to be able to share with you this morning, whether you're watching this at home or whether you're in the town church building. I'd like to begin by asking you a question. What's important to you? Is it your health, your job or your role, or maybe your financial situation? Is it future security, the house you live in, or a particular leisure interest or hobby? Is it family, friends, or faith? If we stop to think about what is most important in our lives, then when the rubber hits the road, I want to suggest that relationships would be at the top. When someone is near the end of their life, achievements, awards, roles, success, status, or things they've acquired become of secondary importance to the time they have left with those close to them. COVID-19 has reminded us, hasn't it, of the importance of relationships in life. Just the absence of a touch or a hug, or being physically able to be with family members that we love during lockdown has been hard for many, because relationships are foundational to being human. When our eldest daughter Bethany was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma 2 years ago, aged only 19, many things that seemed to have importance in my own life quickly became less important. Many seemed suddenly trivial even, because the real possibility of losing my daughter focused my mind, and it focused my priorities. Time spent together, memories being built, things I wanted to share and impart, or simply travelling the journey together were what really mattered in life. Jesus himself teaches, doesn't he, that the most important thing in our lives is relationships. Our relationship with God and our relationship with others. When he was asked what is the most important thing that we can do in our lives, he replies by saying, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength, and love your neighbour as yourself." Relationships are ultimately the most important thing. The reason I start there today is because we're in our third talk in our series on the book of Nehemiah. A book all about this man called Nehemiah who wants to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild its broken walls. And in the second half of chapter 2, which we're looking at today, the reading we heard just a moment ago, we see that before he rebuilds, he takes time to look at what's important. Before he rebuilds, he takes time to look at what's important. We'll come to the details in a moment, but I believe that's a principle that's just as true today if we're looking to rebuild something. That before rebuilding, we should take time to look at what's important. We're at a point, aren't we, where we're thinking about rebuilding as town church after our building has been closed and much of what we did before has stopped. We're not able to gather physically, and a few new ways of being connected have been explored. COVID-19 has shown us so clearly that church is not ultimately a building or a place or a service that we attend, but it's the people of God, who are still church whether we're scattered in our homes and locked down, or whether we're gathered in a place. Because it's the relationships that we have both with God and with each other that are the most important thing about being church. It's why keeping connected has been so important during lockdown, whether that's through phone calls or emails, or online services or weekly quizzes, prayer days or a prayer map, a connect group or TCK online, whatever it might be. On our newsletter each week, the welcoming paragraph says we're a community of people being transformed by Jesus, seeking to express the heart of God in the heart of our community. Being church, being town church, is all about relationships. So before rebuilding, let's take time to look at what's important, to look at our relationships. Now in Nehemiah chapter 2, we see in verse 11 that Nehemiah finally reaches Jerusalem. He knows what he's come to do, which is to rebuild the walls, but he doesn't tell anybody that yet. Instead, he simply sets out one evening very quietly to examine the walls in verse 13. In the NRSV it says to inspect the walls. Why does he do that? Well, he's looking, isn't he, before rebuilding. He's looking to see what's important as he begins his task. Where's the damage? Where should he start? How should he begin? What's the most important thing to do? Earlier in Nehemiah, we've seen the importance of prayer as we think about rebuilding. Mike mentioned that last week, I did in the first talk. Here, though, we see the importance of inspecting, of looking at ourselves. Because whilst Nehemiah is wanting to rebuild physical walls of stone, we're wanting to rebuild church, which is not about physical stones, but as we've seen, the relationships we have together as the people of God. It's what 1 Peter chapter 2 says when we read these words. You also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood. You're a chosen people. You're the people of God. In other words, we are church, and our relationships are the glue that holds us together. So before we begin rebuilding, I think we should take some time to inspect, like Nehemiah does, to look at what's important, to look at our relationships, both with God and with each other. Well, there are other things in chapter 2 we could bring out. In verse 16, we see that everyone needs to be involved in the rebuilding. But that's also a big part of chapter 3, and so I don't want to steal Mike's thunder as he looks at that next week. Or in verse 18, Nehemiah says that God's gracious hand is on him. And in verse 20, that God will give them success in their rebuilding task. It's language of God blessing their rebuilding work. And if we think about rebuilding town church post-lockdown, then if we're the bride of Christ, as Ephesians puts it, Jesus will certainly want us to flourish and to grow and to express the potential that he sees within us. And that's encouraging as we think about rebuilding. But today, let me finish by focusing our application on our relationships as we look at ourselves this morning. How is our relationship with God? Our love for him, to use the words of Jesus. How is it individually and corporately? As individuals, I imagine that lockdown will have been a time of spiritual growth for some of us, but maybe if we're honest, spiritual stagnation for others. For me personally, the opportunity to revisit my priorities with all the changes to family life and work life and school life have enabled me to set aside more time in my walk with God and to feel closer to him in my daily life. But I know that for some others, maybe trying to juggle work from home with schooling at home and then living at home has meant that God may have got squeezed out in the busyness of life. Well, if God has got squeezed out, can I suggest that July and August provide a focused time to address this, to look at the most important relationship you have and to invest in it intentionally. Corporately, lockdown has meant that our relationship with God has been less about a service we attend and more about simply worship on a weekend. Less about style and more about an exposure to different styles, and maybe for some of us a growing appreciation of them. Certainly from my perspective over the last few months, the question I've been trying to address in our online offerings is how do we keep connected in worship while we're physically separated? Or maybe that's a question we need to keep asking about our worship together. How do we keep connected? As we look at what services we put on, as we begin to rebuild. Well, that's just beginning to look at our relationship with God, but what if we turn to our relationship with each other? Our love for our neighbour, as Jesus puts it. How is that? Well, as an individual, I personally have loved getting to know my physical neighbours during lockdown. creating a WhatsApp group so we can support each other, holding a socially distanced Liberation 75 tea party in the cul-de-sac, sharing jigsaw puzzles between houses, dropping around cakes to eat and helping with shopping. All ways that simply we can love our physical neighbours. And I passionately believe that it's our love for our physical neighbours where that all needs to begin. To take Jesus literally when he says, love your neighbour. If you've been doing some of that, how can you build on that post-lockdown? If you haven't, how could you start? For we all have neighbours whom Jesus asks us to love. Finally, corporately, lockdown has shown that we are just as much the people of God when scattered as when we are gathered. It's shown it's the relationships we have that ultimately matter, not the service we attend. So let's take time to look at our unity afresh, to explore how we build community as Town Church, to intentionally develop the connection between all of us in Town Church, and from which our worship of God should grow and be expressed. I wonder, what would our worship look like if we truly sought to express unity and build community? What activities could we do throughout the week that would simply grow relationships? Lots of questions today, lots to think about, but that's what's needed as we seek to be renewed, restored and rebuilt. The title of this series in Nehemiah. Before rebuilding then, let us take time over the summer to look at what's important, to look at our relationships, and to start from there. Take care.